Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Tomogno Jana. I am a second year postgraduate trainee in the Department of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery in Sri Balaji Dental College and Hospital. So, today I will be presenting with this topic orbital floor reconstruction. So, before we delve into the surgical aspects, we first need to understand the basic anatomy of the orbit. The orbit is a four-sided bony pyramidal cavity which houses the two eyeballs and its associated structures such as the muscles, the vessels, nerves, etc., and part of the lacrimal apparatus and a quantity of orbital fat as well. The medial wall of the two orbits are parallel to each other and are about 2.5 centimeters apart. The lateral walls slope backwards and medially and are almost perpendicular to each other. So you can imagine a sort of triangular section if you see a transverse section from top. The volume of each orbit is about 30 cc's. Now coming to the boundaries, the roof is formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone and the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Thus the roof is pretty robust, as Arif sir had already mentioned. The floor is formed by orbital surface of the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, and the orbital plate of the palatine bone. The floor is quite flimsy. The lateral wall is formed by the zygomatic bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid. This is the strongest wall of the orbit. Now coming to the medial wall, it is formed by the frontal process of the maxilla, the lacrimal bone, the orbital plate of the ethmoid, and the body of the sphenoid. The medial wall is the weakest wall of the orbit, but it is not always fractured due to varying reasons. As all of you can see, the bones which form the orbit, in the pink color coded the frontal bone, as you can see over here. The yellow color coded is the sphenoidal bone. The green color codes the lacrimal bone. The orange forms the ethmoidal bone. The purple forms the maxillary bone, and the cyan color is the zygomatic bone. Now contents of the orbit. The orbit, the anterior one-third of the orbit consists of the eyeball, just the anterior one-third, and the rest of it is constituted of the fossa, which are of two types, the orbital fossa and the bulbar fossa. The extraocular muscles, which are 7 in number, the superior rectus, the lateral rectus, the inferior rectus, the medial rectus, the inferior oblique, the superior oblique, and the levator palpebri superioris. And as you all can see, and many of you might remember, we used to use a mnemonic as LR6, SO4, R3, IO3, LPS3. So this denotes the cranial nerves which control the motor functions of these nerves. So lateral rectus is controlled by the 6th cranial nerve. The superior oblique is controlled by the 4th cranial nerve. The inferior oblique is by the 3rd cranial nerve. The LPS is controlled by the 3rd cranial nerve, and all the other recti are controlled by the 3rd cranial nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve. Now coming to the vessels, the orbit contains the ophthalmic artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery, the lacrimal artery and the infraorbital artery, which is a branch of the maxillary artery, which is a branch of the external carotid artery, superior and inferior ophthalmic veins which drain into the cavernous sinus, and lymphatics. In the nerves, the optic nerve through the optic canal, oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, abducens nerve, branches of the ophthalmic and maxillary nerves, and sympathetic plexus of nerves also constitute the contents of the orbit. As mentioned earlier, a part of the lacrimal gland also constitutes the orbit. It is towards the medial wall, in anterior section of the medial wall. The lacrimal gland is situated, and a portion of orbital fat. Here all you can see the structure and the contents of the orbit, the musculature, how it is attached and where it originates, the extraocular muscles apart from the levator palpebris superioris, originate from the common tendinous ring. Here we can see the optic canal, the superior orbital fissure and the inferior orbital fissure, which is formed by the sphenoidal bones. These transmit the various nerves and vessels which constitute the orbital cavity volume. The optic canal transmits the optic nerve along with the ophthalmic artery. The superior orbital fissure transmits the superior ophthalmic vein, the lacrimal nerve, recurrent meningeal branch of ophthalmic artery, the frontal nerve, trochlear nerve, superior division of the oculomotor nerve, nasociliary nerve, abducens nerve, inferior division of the oculomotor nerve, inferior ophthalmic veins. As you can see, that common tendinous ring is attached near the optic nerve and the superior orbital fissure. The inferior orbital fissure contains the zygomatic nerve, the maxillary nerve, the infraorbital vessels which accompany the maxillary nerve into the infraorbital canal, and also the emissary veins which have direct communication with the cavernous sciences. Now coming to trauma, injuries to the face generally vary very widely in severity. They can range from the most common and trivial to those associated with very serious life-threatening complications. Although in most cases such complications are immediately apparent when the patient is first seen. When the patient arrives in the casualty, most of these can be first assessed properly, but occasionally they can be concealed, which are also known as occult trauma or occult injuries or hidden injuries. So they can develop gradually over a period of several hours. The most common emergency that we maxillofacial surgeons face and are trained to cater to will be airway obstruction from a progressive swelling or any fractured segment obstructing the airway. The injuries to the face can either occur in isolation or they can also be associated with various significant injuries elsewhere on any part of the torso of the patient, some of which can go unnoticed initially, and there are certain methods to check for them as well. In some facial or head injuries, sight-threatening complications may also be associated. These two may not be immediately obvious all the time. This can gradually progress into a visual threatening injury, or these are also known as developing injuries. Initial assessment and management can therefore be very challenging, as all these variables need to be taken into account, and this particularly case following high energy trauma when multiple injuries are more likely to have occurred. So then it becomes very difficult to assess and very difficult to see which portion of the trauma you should be catering to first. And also most of these cases that we cater to are in the form of either RTA or assault, which can be under the influence of alcohol, so it becomes even more difficult for us to evaluate the patient and the injuries. So generally a team approach is therefore very vital, and particularly in the early stages of the management, when the clinical status of the patient and the need for regular assessment and intervention are very much are often at the most dynamic stage. Protocol driven management is nowadays very much important and a very well established concept, and it should most of the time should be followed wherever it is applicable. So we generally follow the modern concept of advanced trauma life support, which constitutes first the ABCDE assessment, which is the airway control with cervical spine protection, B for breathing with ventilation, C for circulation with hemorrhage control, D is disability or neurological status, and E is for exposure or environment. I'll explain each of these very briefly. Suppose for airway control, the clinician should see if the airway is obstructed by any debris or any blood clot or vomit or any fractured segment of the bone which may have displaced posteriorly and obstructing the airway. We have two airways, the oral airway and the nasal airway. We have to see that patency of the airway is always maintained. If patency of the airway cannot be maintained, the clinician has to decide to go for a surgical airway immediately. If normal patency of airway cannot be maintained by just removing debris or the blood clot or relocating the fractured and displaced segment. So B for breathing with ventilation. So in this segment we have to see if there are any breathing difficulties. This is different from airway patency. Breathing difficulties might be due to a pneumothorax or a hemothorax. We have to check for paradoxical breathing, that is, one side of the chest will be going up as normal while breathing in, the other won't be going up, rather it might go down or it might go in contrast. So also there can be flail chest, there can be abdominal breathing. These will tell us certain things, such as there might be a fracture of the ribs which might be causing obstruction to the chest expansion, or fractured rib might have punctured the lung and it might have caused a pneumothorax. A pneumothorax is, or specifically a tension pneumothorax, happens when air gets entrapped between the lung and the pleural membrane, the interpleural space, and this prevents the lung from expanding normally when we breathe in. So we have to check for these and we have to intervene accordingly. For example, for a pneumothorax, the most common technique that is taught to us is to use a needle, a wide bore long needle, and to puncture the between the second intercostal space in the mid-axillary line. So this will release the tension pneumothorax, or the air that is entrapped between the lung and the pleural cavity. So then the patient will be able to naturally breathe in and breathe out without much hindrance. For C, it's circulation with hemorrhage. We have to see if there is any major vessel severing is there, if there is major hemorrhage happening, because the patient can go into hypovolemic shock if there is a major loss of blood. So we have to immediately go for hemostasis, that is to stop the bleeding from occurring. We have to check either the head and neck region, or if there is a torso bleed, we have to call the particular department, general surgery most of the time. D is for disability, neurological status. For us, the disability section will be checking the optic nerve and the oculomotor nerves using the light reaction, so to check for the pupils if the pupil are constricting or not. So if a patient has both the pupils in a dilated state for a long period of time, there is no reaction to light, it is generally thought that the patient might be brain dead. If there is one side of the eye, any one side of the eye is dilated, the other side is constricting normally, we should be suspecting an optic neuropathy, like due to the trauma there might be some constriction towards either the optic nerve or the vessels supplying the optic nerve. So we have to accordingly do the intervention as fast as possible. E is for exposure or environment. We have to check if the patient is going into hypothermia or not. If the patient starts shivering, if the patient's temperature is too low, patient is going into hypothermia, we have to immediately raise the patient's temperature to the normal levels. So the second principle is primum non nocere, that is, first, do no harm. We should not increase the trauma in any way. We should not cause the patient's morbidity to increase by the things that we do. We should be very careful of that. The second concept in that, while we were talking about A assessment, airway control with cervical spine, that cervical spine comes very importantly in primum non nocere. That is, if there is a head injury patient or a facial injury patient, we have a very high chance to suspect that there might be a cervical vertebra trauma as well, which might have a fracture or a displacement or a disc dislodgement, which might cause a cervical spinal cord pathology. If we are not careful, if we do not rule out those things, if we move the head, or if the patient moves around, if the patient is under intoxication, generally the patient will keep on moving around. It's very difficult to control. He might cause a permanent damage to the spinal cord, leading to lower limb or even upper limb paralysis permanently. So we have to generally take a C-spine AP and lateral view and rule out if there is any fracture or if the cervical vertebra are impinging on the spinal cord or not, or if there is any hyperextension leading to any pathology. The third is the concept of the golden hour. The thing is, it is an old concept, but it is also pretty valid that most of the intervention should be done within the first 1 hour. Giving a first aid, assessing the patient, stabilizing the patient, keeping the vitals normal, ruling out cervical vertebral injuries. These all should be done within 1 hour so as to decrease the effective morbidity and complications. The fourth is the need for frequent reassessment for evolving injuries. Like I had said, that there are certain injuries which evolve over time. They gradually become more morbid due to several factors. There might be internal bleeding, there might be increased pressure in the orbital cavity. All these are evolving injuries. There might be intracranial bleed, which might be happening gradually and increasing the intracranial pressures. So these need to be assessed and monitored frequently so as to prevent patient mortality and morbidity both. The fourth is the importance of mechanism of injury. This is very important because we know that there are generally two types of injury, blunt and sharp injuries, and among blunt injuries also there are two types, high energy impact and low energy impact, and the type of treatment or the intervention you will do will depend very differently upon the type of injury the patient has suffered, and also the different signs and symptoms and the complications related to will also be very different. The most straightforward or simple cases also can rapidly deteriorate if occult, that is, hidden injuries remain unrecognized for too long. For example, injuries to the torso, especially to the chest, can significantly affect the timing of surgery, particularly if this is delayed because of the things that I had said, like flail chest, hemothorax, pneumothorax, all those things. As surgeons, we always need to be aware of these issues, and failure to recognize them may greatly influence the outcome, always. From our perspective, emergency care, like our means from maxillofacial surgeon's perspective, the emergency care in facial trauma effectively means airway management, control of profuse bleeding, and the management of vision-threatening injuries. This is also known as VTI. The management of life-threatening head injuries is outside of our area of expertise and requires urgent neurosurgical intervention. We often in like polytrauma cases or severe trauma cases, we often work in tandem with a neurosurgeon so as to completely treat the patient or the morbid conditions. For example, if a patient has had a frontal bone fracture or temporal bone fracture or parietal bone fracture with exposure of the dura mater or exposure of even the brain also, the neurosurgeon has to intervene into this first, and then only we can come into it. When addressing injuries above the collarbones, that is the clavicles, we consider them in the four main anatomic subheadings or levels. The first comes the brain, then comes the neck, then the eyes, then the face. This comes in accordance to the importance. As you can see, this is a very common sight in an high impact trauma case. First we go for the brain, we evaluate. See, there is a frontal bone fracture. We need to do a CT scan to see if there is any hemocephaly or pneumocephaly, or if there is an intracerebral bleed, which might be a supraarachnoid bleed or subarachnoid bleed. It might be a subdural bleed or intraventricular bleed, and the mortality and the might increase accordingly. So after we assess the brain, we go for the neck, because there are major vessels there like the carotid and the jugular, which might have suffered severing or crushing, which can cause rapid hypovolemic shock due to either internal bleeding, or there might be external bleeding as well. Then we go for the eyes, because the vision threatening injuries are very common and the morbidity sets in very fast. So we have to act accordingly. We have to check if the intraorbital pressure is increasing or not. Most of the time we'll call in an ophthalmologist to check the intraorbital pressure with a tonometer, and we'll check the optic nerve and the extraocular eye movements as well to rule out the vision threatening injuries. And then comes the face. We'll see if there is any lacerations there, if there is any fractures. We'll feel for crepitus or step deformities or mobile segments. We'll also check the CT scan to do a radiological evaluation to aid in our diagnosis, and accordingly we'll manage the patient. So coming to the facial injury triage, most facial injuries can be placed into one of the four groups. That is, 1, immediate life-threatening or sight-saving treatment is required. Example, surgical airway, control of profuse hemorrhage, or a lateral canthotomy and cantholysis. I'll come to lateral canthotomy and cantholysis in just shortly, and I'll finish it also very shortly. The next thing is the treatment. Second category is treatment is required within a few hours. The first category was within a few seconds or minutes. This can be like within a few hours or minutes. It can extend up to an hour or a few hours. This applies to clinically urgent injuries such as heavily contaminated wounds and some contaminated open fractures, especially skull fractures with exposed dura. The patient is otherwise clinically stable. In these cases, the patient will generally be clinically stable. The third category of the treatment can wait about 24 hours. A whole day can be waited if necessary for some fractures and clean lacerations. The fourth is the most common type of trauma that we see. Treatment can wait over 24 hours. It can wait more than one day. That is, most of the fractures that we see, they can wait more than one day to be treated. So coming to the topic that I said, lateral canthotomy and cantholysis, first we need to see what are the canthal tendons. The thing is, we have the lateral canthal tendons and the medial canthal tendons. These actually help in keeping the eyeball in place and not shoot out of the orbital cavity. They hold the eyelid in place and to keep the eye structures in shape. So as you can see, these are known as the tarsals. These semilunar structures are known as the tarsals. These are collagenous, taut collagenous structures which help keep the eyelids in shape, and these are attached to the lateral canthal tendons and the medial canthal tendons, and these keep the eyeball inside the orbital cavity. So this beneficial structure can sometimes cause very severe morbidities. For example, if there is a rising or a developing orbital trauma with a rising intraorbital pressure due to might be intraorbital hemorrhage, or maybe CSF leak might have happened, which is increasing the intraorbital pressure. These canthal ligaments and the tarsals will prevent the pressure from getting released. The eye will keep on getting more pressurized and compressed, and it might cause the optic nerve to get compressed, causing an optic nerve neuropathy, leading to blindness, even permanent blindness. Not just transient blindness, even permanent blindness can also happen. In these cases, what we generally do is, in the emergency ER, we give a local anesthesia, we induce a local anesthesia in the lateral segment, and then we snip. Generally we snip the inferior lateral canthal tendon. Sometimes if it is too severe, we might also need to snip out the superior one as well. We use a scissor to cut out the tendon so as to release the eyelids, so that the eyeball will also get released and the pressure will also get released. So this is an emergency intervention in case of increasing intraorbital pressure, which cannot be resolved even after administering atropine. As you can see, this is how we go about cutting the inferior cross of the lateral canthal ligament. We induce a LA, we do a hemostasis, and then we use a scissor. We give an incision to expose the ligament. It's a Y-shaped furcation where we use a scissor to cut it out. These are very common dilemmas that we face while treating these patients. For example, appropriate airway management in restrained supine patients. So, if you are suspecting a cervical spine injury, you are supposed to restrain the patient's head in order to not increase the injury. Also, in case of severely intoxicated patients, the patient might flail around. So these patients also need to be restrained, and in these cases it is difficult to maintain patency of the airway, because in maintaining patency you need to do certain procedures which are very difficult if the patient is restrained like that. Then management of sudden and unexpected vomiting in restrained supine patients. So in supine patients, if a patient vomits, the patient is unable to control it, and it might get resuscitated. It might get it might go into the trachea and cause an asphyxiation. So we always need to see that if patient is having a belching or a nauseating feeling, we need to immediately let the patient come out of the supine position. But that too is a dilemma, because there might be a suspected cervical spine injury. Yes, the next is clearing the cervical spine injuries. So sometimes the patient might have very unstable vitals. In that case, clearing the cervical spine injuries is very difficult, because you might not be able to move the patient from the emergency OR to the place where they'll take the X-ray. So that's also a dilemma. Then this canine sit-up is a very important thing. The impact of potential torso or spinal injuries on allowing patients to protect their own airway. Suppose a patient is having profuse bleeding in the intraoral and the nasal areas. So this blood will pool around in the airway and will cause asphyxiation and breathing difficulty. So the patient will start having breathing difficulty, and the patient has an urge to sit up. It also happens during vomiting. So it is a safety mechanism. The patient will sit up, and the patient is allowed to drool so as to let the blood flow out of the mouth, so as to prevent an airway obstruction. Then there is permissive hypotension and diagnosing a facial hemorrhage. It is very difficult in multiple trauma cases. Damage control and its effect on the timing of definitive repair. The implications of coexisting skull base and brain injuries. The diagnosing vision-threatening injuries in unconscious patients. Yes, in unconscious patients or in patients with GCS scale lower than 7 or 6 is very difficult to diagnose a vision-threatening injury. And then the management of proptose globe, that is also very difficult, but using a lateral canthectomy or a similar method, we can manage it somehow. Now coming to the topic at hand, orbital trauma. The maxillofacial region of the face consists of various important structures which are enclosed within the protective maxillofacial skeleton structure, and during significant trauma to the maxillofacial region, the orbital bones are very often fractured, which cause a plethora of morbid features such as decreased infraorbital volume, that is enophthalmos. It might also cause an exophthalmos, periorbital ecchymosis, subconjunctival hematoma, increased intraorbital pressure, optic neuropathy, diplopia, retrobulbar hemorrhage, a difficulty in movement of the eyeball, that is extraocular movements, ocular muscle entrapment, which henceforth causes extraocular movement difficulty, formation of fistula and orbital epithelial cysts. It can also be associated with laceration and of the periorbital soft tissues. So the orbital bones get fractured quite often, and we might see two types of fracture, that is blowout fracture or a blow-in fracture. The thing is, the blowout fracture was described by Mackenzie in Paris in 1844, and but the term was coined in 1957 by Smith and Regan, who were investigating injuries to the orbit and the resultant inferior rectus entrapment by placing a hurling ball on cadaverous orbits. They used cadaveric studies to understand the type of injury that happens. and also striking it with a mallet. So a blowout fracture, generally there will be enough thalmus, because the orbital volume will decrease, because there will be releasing of the bones in the form of either a trapdoor or a open door, or which is also known as a bomb bay deformity, and the eyeball will herniate into the maxillary antrum. So the eyeball or the associated structures may herniate into the maxillary antrum so as to release some of the pressure. And in case of blow-in fracture, it is the opposite. The bone segments get displaced into the orbit, thereby increasing the intraorbital pressure. That is generally seen in gunshot wounds, in war injuries, etc. The typical signs and symptoms of an orbital 4 fracture can be inferior orbital ecmesis, inability to do extraocular movements in one or more directions, enough thalmus, and radiologically it may present as the trapdoor or teardrop deformity with herniation of the extraocular muscles and intraorbital fat into the maxillary antrum or the ethmoidal air sinuses through the deformity of the fluid, thus causing muscle entrapment. So this is the classification of orbital wall fractures. It can be blowout fracture, it can be pure blowout fracture, impure blowout fracture, blow-in fracture. An isolated orbital wall fracture can be of roof, of the floor, a medial wall, or the lateral wall. Now we can see the very common types of clinical signs and symptoms which come to us when we see a patient with an orbit trauma. So you can see there is swelling and ecchymosis, subconjunctival hematoma is there. There is proptosis is also there. You can see these are known as raccoon eyes. This happens due to the blood getting deposited in the loose areolar tissue in the periorbital region. So you can also have diplopia with a squint due to entrapment of the muscles in the defect. So we also come across commonly sharp trauma or lacerations in the periorbital regions. This is a patient that I had received in the casualty. He had quite a big laceration in the upper eyelid, and there was profuse bleeding. I controlled the bleeding and then did a suturing. This is another patient who came while I was in the casualty. This patient was taken care of. The first aid was given by general surgery department in another hospital, and they had advised the patient to come to a hospital where there is a maxillofacial surgeon available. So the patient had reported, I had received the patient, and this is the condition at which I had received the patient. So since we are maxillofacial surgeons, just not the function, the form is also very important. The aesthetics, the face is the most aesthetic part of the body, so aesthetics is also very important. So if we had left this patient to be like this, it would have developed into a very nasty scar due to secondary healing, and this would have become a lifelong scar. So I removed the staples, as you can see in the left photo. You can see this is the skull. The laceration was skull deep. I could palpate the clean skull. I cleaned it and then I put sutures on it using Ethilon 5.0, and the deep sutures I did with Vicryl 4.0, which is a self-resorbable suture material. So coming to radiological signs and symptoms, this is a typical trapdoor deformity that we see. You can see it's a trapdoor. The floor of the orbit has fractured in one segment and it has opened like a trapdoor, and there is this teardrop deformity which happened due to the herniation of the muscles and the in the orbital soft tissues. That is a blowout fracture. This is a typical blow-in fracture, when the segments are displaced towards the cavity and the effective volume decreases. This is also another patient that we had received. the patient had suffered a severe trauma with orbital floor fracture, in fact orbital rim fracture, the frontozygomatic fracture, zygomatic buttress and arch fracture, and also there was fracture of the ethmoidal plate as well, which seemed like it was impinging on the orbital nerve, optic nerve. You can see over here, on the contralateral side the gap is much more, in this side the gap is much less. So we went for an ophthalmic opinion. The ophthalmology department ruled out optic neuropathy, and thus we managed the patient henceforth. You can see the CT scan of the patient. There was complete hemosinus was there. The floor was displaced inferiorly. This is the same patient's 3D reconstruction of the face. You can see there is gross combination of the fracture site and the bones. The anterior wall of the maxillary sinus is completely fractured and comminuted. The inferior orbital rim is fractured. The floor is fractured. The frontozygomatic suture is fractured. The zygomatic buttress, the bone is fractured, as well as the arch is also fractured. This is the contralateral side. You can see this is the normal anatomical structure. So coming to treatment, traditionally orbital wall defects were repaired with autologous bone graft material, but recently, due to various researches being done and technological advancements going on in material sciences, various alloplastic and allogenic reconstructive materials are also being used. Among allogenic graft materials, the most commonly used ones are freeze-dried irradiated bone, and alloplastic materials are frequently used and which are still in research. Most of them are still in research and are of two types: porous and non-porous. The non-porous materials consist of titanium plates, hyaluronate or carboxymethyl cellulose, nylon, silicone, polytetrafluoroethylene. And porous materials consist of hydroxyapatite, composite implants, poly L or D lactide plates or polyglycolic acid plates, and also tissue engineering and bone regenerative materials. So coming to autologous graft materials, we all know what is autologous graft materials. It is taken from the same patient. The donor and the host are the same patient. These materials harvested from the patient's own body. They are the traditional grafting materials that have been used over several decades for various types of procedures, not just orbital trauma cases. For orbital reparative surgeries, autologous bone is harvested from generally the iliac crest, maxillary buttress, mandibular symphysis, or the calvaria and the ribs. They are of highest biocompatibility among all grafting materials. They are very cheap, and it causes very less instances of post-operative infection. They also very easily integrate with the host site because it is having the same type of antigenic signature and has the least chance of extrusion. However, it is also the most unpredictable in considering the rate of resorption that happens, so as to giving rise to other types of post-operative complications such as enophthalmos. Suppose the graft material resolved before the orbital structures were stabilized, and the bone regrew and merged with the graft. So an enophthalmos can reoccur. Diplopia, unpredictable orbital volume can also occur, and is also associated with donor side morbidity, and thus adding to patient discomfort, because we'll be cutting off a portion of the patient's functional bone so as to form the graft. This type of graft material is also usable only in repairing very small defects, because a large volumes of bone cannot be resected from the patient's donor site, because it will cause even higher morbidity. Coming to allogenic graft material, allogenic graft material are harvested from a different individual than the host, but are of the same species. For orbital bone defect repair, at one point of time, freeze-dried allogenic bone grafts were used. They are pretty cheap, quite biocompatible, and showed acceptable results. But the use is controversial in nature and is widely avoided in present scenario because it was shown that, to cause fatal Creutzfeldt-Jakob-Prion disease. It's a type of prion disease where there is gradual, complete organ failure and brain death, which happens due to the prions. More research is generally needed in this field of prion-related diseases in order to implement these materials for orbital defect repair, and is even more susceptible. Orbital floor injuries or orbital like any wall injuries are even more susceptible to a Creutzfeldt-Jakob-Prion disease according to studies. Coming to alloplastic materials, these are biocompatible and artificially manufactured grafting materials. They are generally easy to fabricate, quite cheap, and easy to use, and they generally show quite less adverse effects post-operatively. They majorly of two types, non-porous and porous types. Non-porous types materials were the first type of materials that were used for repairing the various defects. They are very easily available, very cheap, very easy to handle intraoperatively, and show quite comparable or decreased or a bit decreased post-operative complications to porous materials. But they also show higher incidence of post-operative infection, intrusion, and migration. Examples are hyaluronate or carboxymethylcellulose. This was first used in abdominal surgeries and abdominal surgery repairs. It is one of the most oldest type of reconstructive material known to surgeons. Then came silicone. Silicone is a very cheap and commonly found material. They are generally used in various reconstructive and aesthetic surgeries, for example in breast enhancement surgeries or lip enhancement surgeries. They were also used in orbital reconstruction surgeries, but they give rise to various other kinds of complications like encapsulation, which causes hindrance in the eye movements, so they are not used. Nylon was also used for a certain point of time, but its structural integrity was not that good, so it was also rejected. Polytetrafluoroethylene is a very good material. It has very nice structural integrity, is able to support the orbital contents very nicely, but the thing is it showed very strong fibrous reaction, encapsulation, and thus causing hindrance in eye movements, so that was also stopped from using. Next comes the most important type of non-porous material, that is pure titanium or titanium alloy meshes. As we all know, titanium is the most biocompatible alloplastic material, as it was shown by Brandmark many decades ago. It shows very strong osseointegration. It is very easily contoured and is very highly malleable, so we can do an intraoperative contouring and according to the shape of the orbit of the patient. It is very easily stabilized as well, either with titanium screws or with tie-in sutures as well. It shows acceptable levels of fibrovascularization, because the thing is titanium generally being very much biocompatible and having a high osseointegrative property, blood vessels form around it very easily, and that is also another kind of problem, because that is why it gives rise to material specific complications like intense fibrotic reaction between the implant and the periorbital tissues, resulting in extraocular motility restriction, symmetrical eyelid retraction. Also due to intense osseointegration, if there is any complication, it is extremely difficult to remove the implant if required. Now coming to porous materials, these are generally these yield very much better results than that of non-porous materials in the form of lesser instances of extrusion, migration, infection. They are easily molded intraoperatively. Also, they are porous materials which cause fibrovascular ingrowth, thus reducing the chance of extrusion, migration, and fibrous encapsulation. Because the thing is, even if a material is biocompatible, the body will treat it as kind of a foreign material and cause an encapsulation to happen around it if it is not porous in nature. Because the blood vessels cannot go through it, so it will go around it and cause an encapsulation. But in case of porous materials, the blood vessels and nerves can travel through the porous material, and thus there is no encapsulation. So the first the porous polyethylene was used. It is a very good biocompatible material, but its structural integrity is not good and is also pretty expensive. Second comes hydroxyapatite. The most expensive type of porous material used in current state is hydroxyapatite, and it is also very very brittle. It is very difficult to handle intraoperatively because it cannot be molded or shaped according to the shape of the orbit. It comes preformed, so it sometimes causes hindrance, and it's brittle, so it might sometimes break or crack while placing it in intraoperatively, so it is very technique specific. Also, its rate of absorption is also very unpredictable, so it might resorb very slow in some patients, it might resorb very fast in some patients, so the results vary from patient to patient, so it is also not a very viable material. Coming to composite implants, these are the modern implants that is used most frequently. It is also the material that we use in our hospital for orbital flow reconstructions. It is the most it comprises of a titanium mesh core sandwiched between two layers of porous polyethylene. It is highly biocompatible. It allows fibrovascularization and fixation due to the porous nature, thus eliminating the chance of extrusion or migration of the implant. It is highly malleable, thus allows easy shaping intraoperatively. It is also easily contourable. It shows very high biocompatibility and can come with an impermeable coating on one or both sides to prevent orbital tissue adherence. Also, retrobulbar hemorrhage and hematic cysts have been reported in some cases, but it is extremely rare. That's why this material is so commonly used. And this very rare kind of complication is generally due to chronic irritation to the periosteum and nothing. Fourth is the poly-L-DL lactide plates. It is a very recently discovered and approved material by the FDA only in the 1995. Still research is going on this to show if there is any long-term adverse effects of this or not, because not enough time has passed for the studies to show any conclusive results. And the fifth is tissue engineering and bone regeneration. This is the cutting edge or bleeding edge of technology we are talking about. This has not been implemented commercially yet. It is yet to be implemented. This implements the using of certain kinds of osseo-inductive, osseo-conductive and osseo-generative materials, which when placed in the defect will cause the host to regenerate bone at a very rapid and controlled manner. So this has not yet been researched as sufficiently. So we can see on the left is the pure titanium or alloy mesh that was previously used, but now we generally avoid it. And this is the most modern and the most commonly used type of composite material mesh that we use. It is completely porous, so it helps in the vascularization, and it can be fixed using titanium screws. You can see over here there are screw holes there which can be fixed to the rim, or you can also use tie-in sutures to stabilize it. So now coming to the case presentation, orbital floor fractures are pretty frequent cases in our hospital, but I have selected the most yes sir. Sir, this is a yes sir, this will finish very fast, sir. Yeah, so I have selected a very recent case so as to also emphasize on how during the COVID times things have changed a little bit as well. So the patient was a 32-year-old male patient reported to the ER in Sri Balaji Medical College and Hospital on 30th July at 2:50 p.m. with a history of alleged self slip and fall from a two-wheeler. On 25th July at 3 a.m. under the influence of alcohol. The patient complained of pain in the left side of the face below the left eye since 6 days ago. On examination, in general examination, the patient was conscious at the time of seeing the patient and well oriented to place, time and person. The patient was afebrile. Patient had no history of loss of consciousness, seizure or vomiting. Patient had just one episode of nosebleed post-trauma, but there was no fresh bleeding at that time. Patient reported that first aid was administered priorly after RTA in a government hospital. And in the government hospital itself, the cervical spine X-ray has been taken and cervical and the spinal neuropathy had been ruled out. So this is the patient when he arrived. You can see there is a swelling in the infraorbital region in the left eye, and there is still evidence of periorbital ecchymosis. So local examination extraoral, the swelling present in the left infraorbital region which was tender on palpation. Infraorbital ecchymosis was evident. Subconjunctival hemorrhage was evident in the inferior border of the left eye. Difficulty in extraocular movement in the vertical plane was seen. No evidence of bony discontinuity or step deformity was evident on palpation. Light reaction of pupils were normal. Intraoral, no relevant findings. CT scan of brain and 3D construction of facial bones were advised. CT brain showed no abnormality in correspondence to Department of Neurosurgery. We had consulted neurosurgery and they had ruled out any brain morbidity. CT facial bones showed medial wall and floor of orbit fracture with teardrop deformity in the left eye. Here you can see in the CT sections, the left side has in a hemosinus, and in the reconstruction you can see there is medial wall fracture and floor fracture as well. In the coronal section we can see there is a floor fracture leading to a teardrop deformity, and in this transverse section we can see that there is a medial wall breach which has caused the medial rectus to herniate inside the ethmoidal cavity. The same patient's different slides. So we sought an opinion from Department of Ophthalmology to rule out retrobulbar pathologies, and they ruled out and they said that there was no ophthalmic pathologies there, and we could go on with our line of treatment. So the patient was advised to take a COVID RT-PCR test, and after the COVID results came as negative, he was admitted under Department of OMFS in Sri Balaji Medical College and Hospital. The body temperature and oxygen saturation was monitored every 6 hours, because we know that even though RT-PCR has ruled out COVID, it is not always very accurate. So the patient was monitored for any signs of COVID infection every 6 hours. The investigations which are given were ECG, X-ray chest AP view, HIV 1-2 spot test, anti-HCV spot test, HBsAg spot test, BTCT, PTINR, serum electrolyte, LFT, RFT, RBS, FBS, CBC, platelet count, blood grouping, RH typing. Medications which were prescribed after admitting were taxine injection 1 gram IVBD, Metrogyl injection 400 mg IVBD, injection Voveron was SOS, it was generally IM. If the patient had pain, the injection was administered. These were all after food. Injection PAN 40, IV BD before food, and tablet Chimal Fort TID before food. These were all administered for 5 days. After all the investigative results were found to be normal, the treatment plan was devised. The patient was planned to undergo an ORIF under GA, that is open reduction internal fixation with an orbital flow reconstruction with composite mesh. Opinion was sought from Department of General Medicine and Department of Anesthesia for fitness for surgery. The patient was assessed to be fit for surgery under ASA 2. Nasal airway was planned. 18G secure IV line was administered. Skin preparation was done. Patient was put under nil per oral, that is NPO, since midnight of the day of surgery. Patient was shifted to the OR at 8:30 a.m. for observation and monitoring for vitals before administering GA. After washdown, PP kit was donned by all visiting surgeons, anesthetists and clinicians. The procedure, general anesthesia were administered and nasal intubation was done. Surgical site was painted with 5% betadine solution. Surgical site was flooded with local anesthetic with vasoconstrictor so as to give a proper hemostatic condition. Then the infraorbital rim was identified by palpation. A semilunar infraorbital incision was placed in the left side of for about 3 centimeters in length. The window was enlarged using an artery forceps. Electrocautery was used to dissect the subcutaneous layers and maintain hemostasis until periosteum was reached. The periosteum was deflected towards the orbit using an Ohm's periosteal elevator. The infraorbital rim was visualized and periosteal flap was raised till the floor of the orbit was visible. A malleable copper retractor was inserted very carefully below the eyeball through the window. and the eyeball was retracted superiorly by the assistant surgeon so as to visualize the floor freely and the defect freely as well. So here you can see after the patient was administered GA, a nasal intubation was done. The patient's surgical site was only exposed. Flooding of the surgical site with LA, placing of the incision, retracting the tissues. Electrocautery machine was used to dissect further and expose the infraorbital rim. As you can see, the retractors have been used to show the infraorbital rim, and then the periosteal elevator was used to retract the periosteal flap even more so as to expose the floor of the orbit. So then the medial rectus muscle entrapment was visualized and resolved using the Ohm's periosteal elevator. The muscle was taken out from the defect. The bony defect was visualized on the medial wall and floor of orbit. The composite malleable mesh was adapted to the contour of the orbital floor, and the medial wall was inserted over the defect. A 703 carbide bore was used to drill through the infraorbital rim, and 4 into 2.5 millimeter screws were used to secure the mesh to the rim. The cropper retractor was redrawn and the flap was reopposed. 2-layer suturing was done using Vicryl 5.0 and for the deep layer, and Ethylon 5.0 was used for the cutaneous layer. A total of 10 sutures were placed. The surgical site was repainted, a light dressing was placed. The patient was brought back from under the influence of GA and extubation was done. The patient was kept in observation room for an hour to monitor the vitals and then was shifted to the post-operative ward. Injection dexamethasone 8 mg IV BD after food was given, which was to be tapered to 4 mg. The patient was kept under observation for 48 hours and then the patient was discharged. You can see the intraoperative photos. We identified the medial rectus muscle entrapment and we took the muscle out of the defect. Then this is the composite mesh that we use. The mesh was placed and contoured according to the floor of the orbit. The holding pins were contoured according to the rim. Then a straight hand piece and a drill bit was used to drill and place the titanium screws. 4 titanium screws were used to fix the mesh to the rim of the orbit. Then the copper retractor was taken out. The flap was reopposed and suturing was done in 2-layer method. Post-op inspection, the patient was recalled after 10 days for inspection and review. The X-ray of PNS, that is paranasal sinus, was taken, which showed no evidence of implant displacement. Patient showed satisfactory increase in extraocular eye movement. Diplopia was completely resolved. Wound healing was satisfactory. There were no fresh complaints. The cutaneous sutures were removed and light dressing was done. Topical Kenacort 0.1% ointment was prescribed to be applied on the surgical scar so as to resolve the surgical scar. This is the post-op pics after 10 days. As you can see, the swelling has gone down a bit. This is after removing the sutures, and this is the PNS view where you can see the mesh in proper position and no displacement. Coming to the complications that generally can arise is it's very rare, but sometimes it may happen. Typical complications are that of host versus graft reaction, loosening of screws causing inflammation, and migration of implant, the inflammation in retrobulbar region causing optic neuropathy or tissue adherence, infraorbital paresthesia, hindrance of the extraocular eye movements, infection leading to an orbital fistula or an abscess. In this case was devoid of any such complications. The patient is still devoid of any postoperative morbidity even after 2 months of post-op. These are my references. Thank you.